Thanks for joining us for another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum, where all voices matter. As part of our Remembrance Week tradition, Boom and Bust is delighted to have back with us Dr. John Robson. He is a professor, columnist, and historian. We'll discuss the latest geopolitical landscape. Welcome back, John.
Good to be here.
First, I guess a lot has changed since a year ago when we had our initial discussion about things. Can you take us through the state of affairs in the world today?
It's obviously the big change is that Russia has invaded Ukraine and it has not gone well. The invasion itself was something of a shock, stepping outside the normal bounds of what we thought were conventions. But that the mighty Russian military should have turned out to be such a bust is a really an astonishing thing. And I think it must be causing a lot of concern in Beijing, where China is continuing its ugly rise to what it imagines will be world dominance. But they've got to be asking themselves, even could we invade Taiwan? Would we actually succeed, or would we find ourselves in the same kind of humiliating disaster with no exit strategy? So, in that sense, the world is both a more violent place and a slightly a more hopeful one, because the ability of the Ukrainians to resist Russia is a sign that these ominous powers that think they're on the rise, or at least in a good position to throw their weight around. If Vladimir Putin really thought Russia was on the rise, he's even more demented than we imagined. That they're going to find this somewhat more difficult for reasons ranging from just sheer determination to the technology of modern warfare. Evidently, it is favoring the Ukrainians to a degree that we did not see coming.
There's so much to unpack there. Clearly, Putin didn't think that Ukraine really existed. He thought it was just an adjunct of the of being Russian or having a Russian ethnicity. And yet, we've seen Ukraine and Ukrainians fight fiercely for their ability to be sovereign and to be a different nation from Russia. That's got to be one of the takeaways as well.
Yes, and the old lesson that one of the great dangers of tyranny is that they silence dissent even within their deliberations, and therefore they are denied essential information. And it's interesting to reflect. I mean, Russia put on a kind of hapless performance in the First World War, and then much more, Soviet Union put on a much more impressive one in the Second World War. But it's important to remember that the Ukrainians were fighting with the Russians that time, and there is a certain grandiose absurdity about Vladimir Putin's vision, as there have been for the Slavophiles going back centuries, that Russia was a world historic power culturally and intellectually as well as militarily, and they would save the West from itself. And nobody else even knew they thought it, right? And when they hear it, they go, "Well, that's pretty weird." Now, the other thing that's going on, and it has impacted this war, is that Western nations are deliberately crippling their own economies by waging war on their energy sectors.
Mm.
And so Europe is looking at a very, very hard winter because they have gotten rid of what works in return for what doesn't work, and then made themselves beholden to Russia of all inane decisions. I mean, the Germans have been doing this for more than a decade. When Donald Trump warned them, they laughed in his face. And it's this weird kind of pseudo sophistication that being dependent for on an ugly tyranny for our warmth and our shelter basically is a sign that we are mature and sensible. And developing our own energy sources or being dependent on those awful Americans is a sign that we are childish and belligerent. How this ever came to pass for sophistication, I don't know, but there's going to be a reckoning. I mean, from Germany to the UK, it's going to be a very, very hard winter. And it's going to be a hard winter because partly people bought into this notion that mankind has set the sky on fire, which is in itself kind of weird, but also that windmills and solar panels really were a mature technology that could take the place of oil, natural gas, and of course, now the Germans are finding coal. And then this decision to shut down nuclear reactors. I mean,
Yeah.
even if you're all in on the global warming panic, what is your objection to nuclear power? So that we see that while the parts of the world are in the hands of really rather stupid tyrants, it seems that the democratic world is in the hands of people who are not much less foolish. They're just more constrained by their institutions.
Indeed, and of course, the French are they've got I think a 40 or 50% of their energy sources are nuclear power. So they're surprisingly, perhaps one can say that the French are on the right track and the Germans are absolutely on the wrong track. Before you comment on that, We are going to take a brief break. We're here with Dr. John Robson. He is a professor, a columnist, and a historian. This is our traditional, now second annual Remembrance Week discussion of geopolitics. We'll be back after these messages. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Dr. John Robson. John, talking still focused on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which really has dominated geopolitical discussions this year. We will get to China in a second, but really wanted to get a sense of you seeing, you mentioned how the West kind of coalesced and was working together. Obviously provided a lot of military equipment as well as intelligence for the Ukrainians. Can that continue, or are we living on borrowed time on that front?
Some of us certainly are. I mean, again, when the Canadian military decides to pass on its equipment to another country, you know that that other country is either in big trouble or else somewhat deluded. We are essentially ourselves disarmed. And again, another of these very fatuous kind of policy courses that's been pursued by parties, frankly, of all stripes. It's not a matter of the current incumbents. The United States obviously is in a better position to supply Ukraine, though we now hear that apparently it was sea dues that they've been using in part to really constrain the Russian Black Sea Fleet. But you know, one of the things about even modern warfare is very ammunition intensive.
Hmm.
That these weapons work wonderfully, but there you need a lot of them, and Canada, of course, doesn't have that. And so I think we've been left again in a position where we strut about the world stage, thinking the world needs more Canada, and the truth is that Canada needs more military. So we're in a rough way, but some other NATO countries, and again, it's almost always it's Uncle Sam who's really doing the heavy lifting. Everybody likes to complain about the United States, but you know they do.
Will that
Significant
continue
fight.
after the midterms? There's some rumblings on both the left and the right in America that there will be no more blank check, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean that sort of talk, I guess, sounds good at election time. But after the humiliating retreat from Afghanistan, which does, of course, help illustrate the limits of American power, so prudence is not a bad thing. But the idea, okay, we abandoned Afghanistan, let's abandon Ukraine and see how the world looks at our
Yeah.
threats from then on. I hope that cooler heads will prevail. Though again, increasingly, I must say, I look at the modern world and I wonder where all the adults have gone. You always like to think that politicians may say dumb stuff in public, but in private, they're listening to somebody who's a bit less goofy. But as we've seen with the inquiry into the invocation of the Emergencies Act here in Canada, the people who were meant to be in charge really were behaving like spoiled children. And so, you know, you're just hoping somehow the American system and American culture has a certain amount of strategic depth despite everything. But it's amazing how frivolously, and of course, democracies behaved frivolously prior to World War II as well, and even World War One. So you might think, okay, we've seen this movie before. We get our act together when the time comes. But you know, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Franklin Roosevelt asked in genuine bewilderment, he said, "What kind of people do they think we are?" And I am not convinced that we are quite the same kind of people,
Hmm.
with the same kind of understanding when push comes to shove that you put away childish things and act like adults. I'm hoping so. And again, the Ukrainian resistance has been so inspiring. It's hard to believe that people would not feel, well, if they can do that, we really better do what we can do.
Yes, no, it has been inspiring, and of course, President Zelensky has done an admirable job rallying not only his people but the world as well. One does not want to see him fail, that's for sure. Kind of funny, I mean, we were talking about the Russian military, and now they're deploying Iranian drones because their own ordnance really didn't have much of an effect. Really interesting to see how warfare is changing before our eyes.
It is interesting, and it's interesting to see the ways in which it's not. To see, you know, what we're seeing in Ukraine is an artillery war.
Right.
Well, that's what we saw in both world wars, though people tend not to realize it. The artillery's gotten better, but and I just saw an article today about, oh, I guess the flying tanks don't work, right? That the ground attack aircraft weren't so impressive. And in a way, the flying tanks didn't work in Vietnam either, and I suppose they didn't work in Afghanistan. That in a strange way, it's a Back to the Future war. Even and there was this article I mentioned about the Sea-Doos talking about, oh, the problem for warships today is going to be these swarms of small mobile craft. And people may not know, if you ever look at warships and you find out that the feeblest thing on the water is called a destroyer, and you're thinking, why is that one the destroyer? And the answer is that when the battleship ruled the waves, there was a fear that these small mobile German E-boats, or the American PT boats, would turn out to be able to dance in, blast them, and zoom back out. And destroyers were E-boat destroyers.
Mm.
So in a strange way, we're seeing that warfare has changed less than we thought. Although I see this, that the Chinese now have a headless robot dog with a machine gun. So everybody who thinks dancing robots are cute better reconsider that one, because
Yes,
there's a kind of warfare that will be even worse than the 20th century kind.
indeed. A very good point. And we are going to get to China, but we're going to do that after this next break. Please stay with us. We'll be right back. And we're back here at Boom and Bust for our traditional Boom and Bust Remembrance Week conversation with Dr. John Robson. He is a professor, a columnist, and historian. John, let's talk a little bit about the intersection between the invasion of Ukraine and China's aspirations. Xi Jinping has this atypical forever term as the second greatest helmsman, I suppose. So how does first of all, we'll get to the internal dynamics of China in a second, but first of all, how do you think Russia's invasion is affecting Chinese calculations?
It must be discouraging them a little bit. The performance on the battlefield certainly hasn't been very impressive. The idea that you go in with second best technology, you come out with second prize, and you know what that is in a war, has been reinforced. And also, I think they may have been surprised that the West responded more firmly than they thought it was capable of doing. I mean, one of the things about people like Xi Jinping is that he has an abundant supply of contempt. He's contemptuous of his enemies. He's contemptuous of his colleagues. He's certainly contemptuous of his allies. It was Shuvalo Majumdar who first made, at least at first I heard, make the remark that Russia's turned into a gas station for China. And I
Mm-hmm.
imagine that, in Xi Jinping's view, they were not anything like equal partners, sort of Saruman and Sauron or something along those lines. But even so, seeing all the orcs get mowed down has got to make you think, wait a minute. We could be less uh, farther from our goal of world domination by 2049, which they're quite open is their goal. 100th anniversary of the revolution, they will be dictating the main direction of world politics, as Brezhnev thought he was about to do. And they must be thinking to themselves, our adversaries might be a little less contemptible than we thought, and we might be just a little less impressive than we thought.
And of course, as they continue to pursue zero COVID, the impacts on their own ability to manufacture and be part of the supply chain has now been effectively questioned and derailed.
Yeah, and this is another of these hidden weaknesses of tyrannies. The fact that they can do almost anything to their populace, no matter how bad it is in any dimension, means that they don't get this kind of feedback. In a free society, or even a semi-free society, if you start to impose really serious economic harm on yourself, there are checks on that in terms of the populace's ability to make you ease off. But in China, nobody can tell the regime, don't do what you're doing. And thus they can persist in mistakes in ways that look like an advantage. Remember our prime minister's famous thing about how China can turn on a dime with its economy. Well, yeah, but sometimes the U-turn is straight into a wall.
Right.
And I think that this is actually one of their problems, the lack of feedback mechanisms in unfree societies. They always look impressive, but some of the things that look most impressive on the surface are actually serious weaknesses in terms of the dynamic motion of events.
Do you think that they're starting to? I mean, certainly they had a lot of wind in their sails over the last few years, not only in their own country, but of course pressing their advantage. I think in Africa and South America and parts of Asia as well. Is that being questioned now, or are they still seen as a reliable economic partner?
Well, they may be seen as reliable economic partners by people who are, to borrow a line from Buster Scruggs, who are no better judges of that than they are examples of it. And the Chinese will find that they've sunk a bunch of money into Africa they can't get back. I mean, you can't saw off the port and tow it back to the Middle Kingdom. Uh, But I think that, I mean, Xi Jinping, one of the scary things about him, he reminds me of an observation by Edward Luttwak, again, back in the 70s about the Soviet Union, that it was a bit like Wilhelmine Germany, that it was optimistic in the short run, but pessimistic in the long run.
Mm.
And this is very dangerous. This makes people gamble. And Xi Jinping, I mean, don't forget, he's 69, right? So he's not going to live forever. If he's going to put his stamp on the world, he's probably better do it in the next decade. He's just seen one of his elderly colleagues escorted out in an apparent state of complete confusion, a man 10 years older than himself. Well, 10 years can go by pretty fast. But they probably think we've got the drop on the West in terms of our big military buildup and our position in Africa, but our demographics aren't looking that good. And how long can we continue to run an economy by losing money on every sale, but making it up on volume? You can't get anything, it seems, that isn't made in China. Even going to the hardware store and saying, do you have a generator that was not made in China? And they're like, well, no, of course not. We don't have anything that wasn't made in China.
All right.
But they're squeezing it out of their people, they're squeezing it out of their ecology, and again, what kind of military performance will they put on with all these only sons, these little princelings?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
It's not something that's going to look better in 10 years than it does now.
We're going to take another short break. We'll be back with our guest after that. Welcome back to Boom and Bust with our guest, Dr. John Robson. John, we've been talking a little bit about China and Russia and some of their failings. This has been an era, and President Biden said the same thing, where it's, the democracies against the authoritarians and the future of the conduct of the world. Are there some lessons to be learned about authoritarians' ability to mobilize and organize, and perhaps their limits of doing that?
There are lessons, and to some extent, they're encouraging that they are not as strong as they look. But in some respects, it's discouraging. They can get going and get ready to attack while we bicker among ourselves about whether there's anything going on, and if there is, whether we should care. And again, we've seen this pattern in the 20th century and before. So we need to remember that tyrannies tend to be aggressive, particularly ones with a certain sort of ideological motivation to save the whole human race from itself. They're not kidding about what they say. And that, I think, is the final takeaway. I've been reading Xi Jinping Thought, which you might think is an oxymoron, and it's been a dreary business, but you want to have an insight into their minds and to understand what their aspirations are, what their fears are. We should always, with Vladimir Putin, when he gave his grandiose speech, and everyone was like, whoa, what was that? Well, that was Vladimir Putin unmasked, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And as we regretted not reading Mein Kampf while there was time, I think we should always assume that the people who claim they want to do us in and take over the world for the following reasons are absolutely serious, both about why they want to do it and how they want to do it. They may tell tactical lies, but the fundamental picture is one that it would be foolish to disregard. And to get us back to fundamentals and to my World War I documentary, we should always remember what made our societies both worth defending and able to defend themselves, and to remember that the dignity of the individual, limited government, and faith in God are what made the West what it is. And if you throw these things away, there is no reason to assume that we will remain invulnerable, or even, invulnerable perhaps is too strong a word for the two world wars, but that we have won because of what kind of people we are. And if we deliberately become a different kind of people, we could lose the next one. So
Right.
don't take it for granted. Get back to Magna Carta and stand on that firm foundation.
And that's certainly what these authoritarians are counting on, that we do have moved or are moving away from some of these fundamentals. And they're trying to further divide through their propaganda and subterfuge. So how do we battle against that?
Do not tell lies. I think it's so important. Solzhenitsyn, I think, once said, if everybody told the truth for a day, communism would collapse. Orlana just quoted from James Fitzjames Stephen that we should go about without sophistries in our mouths or masks on our faces. The first thing we need to do is refuse to acquiesce in anything that we know to be a lie. Not for the sake of world peace, not for the sake of our social position, not for the sake of anything. Should we allow something we know to be untrue to be treated as though it were true? We should not say it is true. We should not remain silent when we know it is false. I think it sounds simplistic, but it really is the truth that will make you free, and freedom that will make you strong.
Can you give an
So it
example
comes
of
back to that.
Can you give an example of what you're thinking of there?
We should not pretend that we can throw away the foundations of ethics and morality and keep morality. And I'm going to say it. I'm going to say it out loud. We should not pretend that the family isn't important. Watch it fall apart and congratulate ourselves on its destruction. This is the foundation of individuals with the internal strength to be self-governing is stable homes. And I think that we have gone far too far in all these ways. So many things that we've said and done because it was just going to be trouble if we stood up and said, no, the emperor has no clothes. And I think it's just, we really need to, not to become rude or belligerent. We've got more than enough of that, but to be firm in never saying a thing that we believe is untrue.
Hmm. Well, there's always a debate about that, but I think it's going to be. I think it's coming to a head. I think that we do not have a lot of time to figure this out. So I want to thank you for coming back on the program. We're just about out of time. Dr. John Robson, he is a professor, a columnist, and an historian. It's great to carry on this tradition of this Remembrance Week broadcast. Thank you again.
Good to be here.
Would also like to thank again Dr. John Robson, great friend of the program. This is the second annual Remembrance Week conversation that we have that goes beyond economics. It goes into politics and really the state of the West and the state of civilization. We've had quite a year on that front, and his insights are always welcome. Thanks for watching today.